Buonasera, buonasera, welcome everybody. My name is Piero della Francesca. I'm the director of the Breyer Center for Overseas Studies at Stanford University. So welcome to Stanford in Florence. We have a lecture series, as many of you know, called Incontri a Palazzo. We meet almost every Wednesday afternoon for a talk. And once a quarter, we have the privilege and the pleasure to host this talk together with Friends of Florence. And as I tell my friend, Countess Simonetta Brandolini Landa, when she comes over, she brings the party, because she always brings wonderful speakers to Stanford University. So I am particularly pleased that we are able to have these two wonderful minds, and Simonetta will introduce in a moment, with us this afternoon. Co-sponsoring this event as we do means that I get to introduce Simonetta and Friends of Florence, and then Simonetta will introduce our speakers. I'll say just very few words about Friends of Florence, which Simonetta Brandolini Landa founded in 1998. As their mission statement reads, the foundation is dedicated to preserving and enhancing the cultural and historical integrity of the arts in and around Florence through restoration projects and educational events. Now, Friends of Florence is an association that practices what it preaches, because they do display a close, strong, and devoted friendship to the city of Florence. I will go through the list of some of the projects that they sponsored and funded and donated back to the University of Florence, and that will give you a sense of the magnitude of their work and the impact that it's been having on the art and the city of Florence as a whole. So one of their projects, which they worked on in 2002, was the restoration of the Loggia dei Lanzi. The Loggia dei Lanzi, as we all know, is in Piazza della Signoria, so imagine how critical and important that was. They did work, preservation work of Michelangelo's David and the prisoners. This, of course, are in the Galleria dell'Accademia. They restored the entire complesso dei rustici, which are now in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. They used to adorn the northern portal of the baptistry of Florence. They worked on Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, that needs no introduction, the cloister of the Vows in Santissima Annunziata. They've also been restoring tabernacles. For those of you and the students as well, as you walk around the streets of Florence, you'll see that more often than not, at some random corner is a beautiful tabernacle that is usually very much run down. A tabernacle is a sacred image. It's oftentimes frescoed on the walls, and they're run down because they are exposed to the weathers, and so they restored two of those recently. One of them is a tabernacle depicting Sant'Agostino, Tobia, the Archangel Raphael, and the angels, and that is at the corner of Via Sant'Agostino and Via Maffia. So it's in the Oltrarno, it's on this side of the river, in the Santo Spirito San Frediano area. That they've also restored, also in San Frediano, the Madonna, Child, and Saints Tabernacle. That is at the corner of Via San Giovanni and Borgo San Frediano. Again, I mention these because those are also wonderful projects, and they're there for us all to see and for the neighborhoods to appreciate. You know, that you're contributing to making the city look better and nicer, and to giving art back to its original splendor. More recently, another project of Friends of Florence involved giving paintings to the sonology ward of the Careggi Hospital. So that's a place where women go to hopefully not be diagnosed with breast cancer, but some unfortunately are. It's a new ward in the hospital of Careggi. It's quite beautiful. The head doctor there put in some art, and Friends of Florence took care of the art adorning that. And that is something that, for example, some very, very generous donors of Stanford University do all the time. I dropped I was at the end of the list. I can't mention all of the projects that they did, but I will mention a project which is going on as we speak. It's a restoration, the restoration of the Botticelli room at the Uffizi Gallery. This will be inaugurated in October, and it's quite a major project because it will completely renovate the entire Botticelli room, and in fact it'll turn it into 2 different rooms. It's a large space. It'll become extraordinarily wonderful. So thank you very much, Simonetta, for pioneering this wonderful foundation, association of Friends of Florence. And as I said at the beginning, display true friendship to the city of Florence. So thank you again, and thank you for bringing the party.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you to Stanford University for our wonderful partnership for the lecture series. I just also wanted to thank the Florence chapter, because many of the projects that you mentioned, especially the Tabernacles and many others, are actually headed by our Florence chapter. We have our 2 co-chairs here today, Kate Collins and Allison Gilligan. So thank you, and if anybody wants information about that, you can just send us an email, and I'll direct you over to Allison and Kate. But I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our 2 wonderful speakers today. We are about to start tomorrow the trail of Piero della Francesca. So we are going to be going, tomorrow we are in Florence still, we'll be traveling to Arezzo, to Monterchi, to San Sepolcro, and then going to Perugia, over to Urbino, finally in Rimini, and on Monday we're going to be back here, probably several pounds heavier because the food there is so wonderful, but we'll also be seeing such wonderful art, and with special historians, Ross King and Bill Cook, and also Elaine Ruffalo, who's here with us this evening. So with our 3 great historians, we'll be able to learn ever more about Piero della Francesca. Many of you already know Bill Cook, Dr. William Cook, but I'll just say a few words because I know you're anxious to hear them speak. Until last year, Dr. William Cook was a distinguished teaching professor of history at the State University of New York at Geneseo, where he taught since 1970. He earned his bachelor's degree cum laude from Wabash College and was elected a Phi Beta Kappa there. He was then awarded a Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Lehman fellowships to study medieval history at Cornell University, where he earned his PhD. Professor Cook has taught courses in ancient and medieval history, the Renaissance, Reformation periods, and the Bible and Christian thought. Since 1983, Professor Cook has directed 11 seminars for school teachers for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And his books include The Medieval Worldview, Images of St. Francis of Assisi, and Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty and Humility. He's also contributed to the Cambridge Companion to Giotto, and edits and contributes to the Art of the Franciscan Order in Italy. I could go on and on. As you can see, I have several notes on my dear friend Bill Cook. He has led many programs with us, taught many courses on Dante with us, St. Francis, and we've also enjoyed together with Ross and Bill his yearly seminars at the Aspen Institute. And this last year was in fact on St. Francis of Assisi in Giotto. What else can I say? He's also taught some great courses for the teaching company. You can order those online. And last but not least, definitely not least, Bill has just started his own foundation, the Bill Cook Foundation, that helps needy children and young adults around the world. And he has 11 adopted children of his own, so he knows how to do that quite well. Thank you, Bill, for all you do for all of us, really. And again, it's a pleasure introducing Ross King, a best-selling author. I'm sure many of you have already read his books. They've been published in Italian and French and in various, many other languages. 5 books, also including nonfiction of Domino, published in 1995, and Ex Libris in 1998, and has edited a collection of Leonardo da Vinci's fables, jokes, and riddles, translated into more than a dozen languages. His books have been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Charles Taylor Prize, the National Award for Arts Writing, and he has won both the Governor General's Award in Canada for The Judgment of Paris and the Book Sense Nonfiction Book of the Year in the United States for Brunelleschi's Dome. In October 2012, his book, Leonardo and the Last Supper, was published, and he just recently co-authored a wonderful book, a little bit large for carrying around on an airplane, but a fantastic book, Florence and the Paintings and Frescoes from 1250 to 1743. Born and raised in Canada, Dr. King has lived in England since moving to London for postdoctoral studies in 1992. He has lectured widely in both Europe and North America, including at events at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Smithsonian, the Aspen Institute, and the Frick Collection. He also gives lectures and guided tours in Florence, Rome, Paris, and Givigny, and he lives near Oxford with his lovely wife, Melanie, who is here with us this evening. So without further ado, Piero della Francesca, thank you.
Thank you. I'll stand on this side, or else my hair becomes part of the demonstration. And I'm speaking first, partly because I'm giving a bit of background to Piero della Francesca, but mostly because I never like to speak after Bill Cook, and so I always engineer things so that my slides get up on the display before his do. Anyway, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about Piero's background, beginning with an exhibition that some of you might have seen in Arezzo in 2007, which was concentrating on what we are looking at this evening, which is Piero and the Italian courts. Some of the reviews of the exhibition, this is the catalogue for it, some of the reviews pointed out that Piero, in some ways this is a misnomer because of the fact that Piero never was an official court artist in the way that, for example, Leonardo da Vinci was the ducal engineer in Milan in the 1480s and 1490s. Piero never had an official position in any court, and in fact he didn't even seem to be the favored artist of the courts at which he worked. And in some way, or at least as far as we know, because sadly, a lot of his work at the various courts in Italy, for example, for the Este in Ferrara, are utterly unknown. It's taken for granted that he worked there because contemporaries, people who knew him, and chroniclers who came later said that he worked in Ferrara, but none of the work survives. And crucially, there is no documentation putting him in Ferrara in the 1440s, 1450s, whatever it was that he seemed to work there. And so what some of the reviewers pointed out, though, is that Piero did have princely patrons. He also had less princely patrons, i.e. local confraternities in places like San Sepolcro. And one of the thrusts of the exhibition was that there wasn't a huge difference between what he did for his princely patrons and what he did for these local confraternities. But what I want to argue tonight is that there is a bit of a difference between what an artist, for example, is only as good as his patrons, his or her patrons are. And so who your patrons are is in many ways going to determine not just the quality of your work perhaps, but the way in which you work, what you get to paint, what you get to compose, what you get to write, and so forth. Anyway, putting any of these disputes aside, one thing that is certain is that in order to see works by Piero della Francesca, you don't go to the Vatican, for example, where in a fresco cycle that he did in the 1450s was destroyed by Pope Julius II, who brought in this young upstart named Raphael, who painted the rooms instead, and began effectively painted over what Piero had done several generations earlier. And you don't even really come to a great city like Florence to see it either. There is Piero here, as I'm sure many of you know. But in order to truly see Piero's work, you have to do the Piero della Francesca Trail, which, as Simonetta said, is what Friends of Florence is doing over the next couple of days. And that means that you go to places that are maybe a little out of the way, that don't generally draw the volume of tourists that places like Florence and Rome end up with. But of course, I think everyone who does that agrees that the pilgrimage, the Piero pilgrimage, is well worth it. The San Sepolcro, of course, is almost ground zero for going to see Piero. Aldous Huxley has a famous quote, the British writer. He says, he's giving a description of, in an essay that he calls the greatest painting in the world. And he says, when the last one is around San Sepolcro, what is there to be seen? A little town surrounded by walls, set in a broad flat valley between hills and fine Renaissance palaces, with pretty balconies of wrought iron, a not very interesting church, by which he means the cathedral, and finally, the best picture in the world. The best picture in the world, according to Huxley, is the resurrection of Christ in the Civic Museum. Other people were equally, this was written in 1925 by Huxley, other people around the same time were equally impressed. Kenneth Clark, Lord Clark of Civilization, if you're British, The man who was probably the greatest English art critic of the 20th century, who was director of the National Gallery in London for many years, said that the flagellation of Christ in Urbino is the best small painting in the world. Clark also said his favorite painting in the National Gallery, which I said he was keeper for many, many years, he said was the Baptism of Christ. And also, he said when in the Uffizi he first saw the double portrait of Federico da Montefeltro and his wife Battista Sforza. I'll put that up in a couple of minutes. When he first saw that painting, he fell down to his knees and had a kind of aesthetic/religious experience. And so Piero, in some ways, is a favorite of the cognoscenti. Must not be close enough to this. And I think that was maybe proved in spades a couple of years ago in New York City when Piero took Manhattan by storm. There was a small exhibition at the Frick which was given ecstatic reviews in many of the newspapers. The reviews were so ecstatic, someone in the New Republic had to write a review criticizing the reviews and say, Piero can't really be that good, can anyone be that good? But nevertheless, he was spectacularly successful there. And the late John Russell wrote back in the 80s that Piero has my vote anytime as the perpetual president of European painting, which wasn't a position I was aware of, but I suppose I would nominate Piero, or I second the nomination for that as well. So as I say, he is someone that the cognoscenti love and respect. And someone who's become a favorite, not just of art critics and art historians, but of painters as well. And one thing that I think we have to bear in mind with Piero is the fact that, despite the fact that he was painting some 550 years ago, 550 years ago, and we tend to put everything from that period back into the distant past and regard that as these are the old masters, and we look at this as part of the heritage industry, etc. What we can't lose sight of, in fact, and I think what you never lose sight of with Piero, is that he was in an avant-garde. He was the great avant-garde painter of the middle part, if not for much of the 15th century, through things like his use of media. He experimented with oil paint. He was one of the first painters in Italy to use oil paint. New technology. He was one of the first painters in Italy to use cartoons and pouncing, charcoal, to transfer his designs from his design stage to the wall itself. And he also experimented with his pigments, turning his, going from using the tempera on plaster, water paint on plaster, and also oil paint on plaster. He was, which is one of the reasons why we don't have all of his work, because not all of these things were advisable in the 15th century, and some of his frescoes were lost precisely because of that. Anyway, Piero was someone who was experimental, and he was an intellectual painter. This is a small corner that from his, probably his most famous painting, his most famous cycle, The Finding the True Cross in Arezzo. Art historians of the postmodern period, or of the post-impressionist period, get very excited when they begin comparing this to works done many centuries later, including the Metz Cézanne painting of Ardan, which Cézanne scholars point out that in 1872, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris got a full-scale copy of The Legend of the True Cross to teach its students how to paint like Piero. And Cézanne, it is believed, saw that at some point. He never went to Arezzo as far as is documented, but so art historians like to claim, Cézanne scholars like to claim, saw that and became interested in this kind of breaking up of form in the way that Piero had been doing it centuries earlier. And in fact, André Lott, who was a cubist, a friend of Picasso, a friend of Guillaume Apollinaire, wrote in 1929 that Piero della Francesca was the first cubist. So suddenly Piero, after being neglected for many centuries, by the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, was being lauded as an avant-garde painter in his own right. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that Piero wasn't simply painting for the sake of the cubists, like Pablo Picasso, in whom again we can see an influence. He wasn't painting merely for Picasso and Cézanne and André Lhote, etc. He was painting for himself, but maybe even more especially for his clients, which then brings me to the point of who his clients were, who he worked for, and also I think I'll say a couple of words about who he was. Usually, I mean, I'm at a bit of a loss with Piero, I have to say, because what I like to do, and we do on Friends of Florence, we've done a Machiavelli tour, and there are wonderful stories about Machiavelli. In my biography of him, I was able to use all sorts of juicy material. Machiavelli was someone who believed that what went on in Verona stayed in Verona, and that Mrs. Machiavelli would not find out about it, despite the fact that he wrote all of his friends and told them about it. Or Leonardo da Vinci, who had a very interesting, he was an elusive character, but he had an interesting private life and a very interesting life in general. And so we would go around to the place, look at the art, look at the houses, etc., and I could tell anecdotes. Sadly, I have no anecdotes about Piero della Francesca, nor does anyone. In fact, the only anecdote I've got of him, in fact, we're not sure what he looked like. It's assumed that these are self-portraits. But what do you notice about this self-portrait? With these two, yes, exactly, you see someone touching the throat. There is an article that a friend sent me who edits the Journal of Human Evolution, which is not a journal I regularly read. But she sent me an article from it in which the Amanda Venturi, who's head of the health services in the Marche region of Italy, who's done studies of iodine deficiencies in hilltop communities in central Italy, he argues that this is a goiter, that Piero had iodine deficiency. It's quite a horrifying article, which makes me think that no one gets enough iodine. And the horrible expression that it had was neurological cretinism. That's what lack of iodine. I mean, this is the clinical marker, the goiter, but the emotional, physical, mental marker is this horrible condition called neurological cretinism. I'm not sure I want to know what exactly that entails, but it's safe to say, I think, that Piero did not have it. Piero was no cretin. He was an absolutely brilliant mathematician, thinker, merchant, painter, etc., etc. But as I say, he was a very mysterious character. We don't know when exactly he was born. We know the minute Michelangelo was born, because he tells us, he had his horoscope drawn up, and we know what constellations were in which other constellations, what stars were in which constellations, etc. We know the hour of his birth. With Piero, we don't even know the year. His parents were married in 1410, and he was the firstborn, and so presumably he was born around 1411, 12, 13. Usually art historians say, guess at 14, 12, 13. And he was born, of course, in San Sepolcro, and that's where he grew up, and that's where he first began his painting career. And it's very interesting that this childhood there very much marked him, and his studies there, whoever he studied with, because I should say we don't know who he studied with. It's known that he worked as a young man with someone named Antonio d'Anghiari, who was from Anghiari, as his name suggests. But it's not known for certain whether Piero went at age 13 into Antonio's workshop and learned at his knee. We don't know, simply don't know who he worked with. We don't know where he got his mathematical learning from, whether it was from books or whether he had a great math teacher. A great scholar, James Banker, has proved that there was no math teacher of any kind of caliber in San Sepolcro in the 1420s, 30s, 40s when Piero was there. And so it's a bit of a mystery where he learned anything. But he was, as I say, a very proud local boy, because on a number of his paintings, he signed himself. He didn't call himself Piero della Francesca. He was Petri di Borgo Santo Sepolcri, Piero of Borgo San Sepolcro. You can see how he's happily signed himself thus on this particular tree, as if he's carved it into it. Incidentally, this character here, and this tells us how desperate people are to find mentors for Piero. This man down here, his name is given. He's Girolamo Adami. And for centuries, people have known that because it wasn't Piero, but someone probably close to Piero put his name. Art historians for decades have ignored that and tried to say he is virtually every humanist, philosopher, mathematician in Italy that you can think of, and that he is Piero's patron. He's the one at whose feet Piero sat and learned everything that he learned. But the fact is, he was a Girolamo Adami. What was shown at the Frick show is that Adami was a silk merchant who was very involved with Piero. And so I think there's now no question that it is him, and that therefore the whole theory of this man as his mentor has probably been scuppered by that. One of the things that art historians like doing with Piero is spotting San Sepolcro in the paintings. This is the Nativity of Christ, one of his last paintings. It's in the National Gallery in London, and you can see in the top right-hand, so we have the Christ Child, Virgin Mary, the very pensive, thoughtful Joseph right there, and a sort of mariachi band of angels which is turned up to observe the occasion. But if we look up here, behind these two shepherds, we can see a cityscape. And it's very interesting that it does appear to be the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo, which is literally across the street from Piero's house, the Casa di Piero. And so the Nativity takes place, it appears, near Borgo San Sepolcro, very close to Piero's neighborhood. He wasn't the only painter of the 15th century, of course, to do this, to put holy scenes in places. Ghirlandaio, of course, said so many things that took place in the Holy Land in Florence, but I think it's very sweet that the small town boy puts Borgo San Sepolcro into the painting. But what happens then? My question is, when you have people, when your patrons are people from this small town, and you're this very ambitious, intelligent, avant-garde painter. This is a contract that Piero had for one of his first works, one of the first works that he was commissioned, which is the Bill will be talking about in a few minutes, the Misericordia altarpiece. And I won't go through all of it, but you can see that there were very strict conditions under which he was going to paint. It had to be in the same form as another painting that was there. Everything he painted had to be agreed with the prior and the prior's representatives. And then crucially, you can see here, it had to be gilded with fine gold, so it had to be a gold-backed painting. And then he had to make it exactly the same as the one that was there previously. And so this is probably the sort of thing that the confraternity, these local men in Borgo had in mind when they commissioned it. Nicola di Segna's Resurrection Polyptych. And Bill will talk more about his paintings, so I won't say too much about it. But they probably expected that Piero would turn up and give them some saints, give them a central scene, some saints in their little niches on either side, rather like if you think of a French cathedral and all the statues of the people standing in the niches, do that in two-dimensional form, as had been done very beautifully 100 years ago by Nicola di Segna. Piero gave him something quite different from that, which was the Misericordia altarpiece. By the way, he was given 3 years to do it. He took decades to do it, which wasn't unusual in the case of Piero. But you can see, at first blush, maybe this does look similar. It looks much like Nicola di Segna's, and so I begin looking at it a little bit closer. And you see the way in which the figures are no longer isolated from one another in their niches. So he does have a predella, he does have the subsidiary saints, he's got something at the top, he does have the bit in the middle, which has a difference in scale between the Madonna and the people beneath the Madonna. But he's then got these figures flanking the Madonna, and they're quite different from what we get painted a century earlier by someone like Nicola di Segna. And we can see that they're all standing. That Piero has requited what the prior wanted, everything is in gold behind. But look at this, they're all standing on the same ground, they're not isolated. In fact, St. Andrew, isn't even standing on the ground, he's standing on the cloak of the woman who's kneeling beneath the Madonna of Mercy. And we can see that they're lit by light. We can imagine that light is coming from the right-hand side and falling like that on the Madonna. And so there is almost a unity of place and a unity of light on this particular painting. The confraternity seemed happy with it. They didn't complain. Piero didn't have any difficulties like that. He may have had difficulties with another work he did possibly even earlier. No one's entirely sure when he began painting it. This painting, you see in San Sepolcro today, it's missing its central bit. It's got, as you can see, the gold back. It's got the two saints, Peter and Paul, in their separate niches, although one small step for mankind, the reach sort of coming out, because it's the middle of the 1450s after all, and they're beginning to move out of their niches. But what should be in the center? You have to go to London, not San Sepolcro, to see it, because in 1861 a buyer, an English buyer, got it and took it back to London, and then was buying from a railway magnate. But the railway magnate died, and so the collector then donated it to the National Gallery, where it's been ever since. Again, I won't talk about this painting, even though there's much to say about it. I'll just say, look at the back. There is no gold back in it. We don't have the contract for this altarpiece, so we don't know if Piero was specifically asked to do it. But this is what it looked like in 1861, when John Charles Robinson came and looked at it and prized that middle section out. And you can see the amazing thing is this was painted first, and this was painted after, a decade or two later, which is almost exactly the opposite of what you would expect. Because look at the way Piero's created space. We've got blue sky, we've got all of these figures occupying exactly the same place, and in fact, of course, we have Borgo San Sepolcro in the background. Just so I can hand over to Bill, are you going to talk about this one, Bill? No? I'll say something very quickly about it. Again, this is there's a great disjunction in this wonderful altarpiece that Piero did for a local group in Perugia of Third Order Franciscans. Sometimes said they were nuns. They were not nuns. They were lay Franciscans, women. And they asked Piero to paint an altarpiece for them. And so he did it. And it's one of the most curious altarpieces of the 15th century, because we have two very different styles. All of it is done by Piero. It's not everyone agrees that Piero did the predella himself. He probably designed it, someone else may have painted it. But Piero did all of this. But you can see there's a great disparity in style between the Annunciation at the top and what we have beneath that. And you can see the way he's gone farther with the people standing on the same ground. In fact, the shadows are falling over one another. He was asked, presumably, to have a gold bag, but rather than just make it pure gold, he's given this wonderful ornamentation. And if we look, and so you can see the kind of Gothic framing that it has, with the crockets and finials, and yet, within that very Gothic frame, struggling to break the mold, break out of that, we see a very Renaissance construction, something that Piero might have seen when he went to Rome, or something he might have seen in the plans of his friends Leo and Battista Alberti. The top, again, the architecture is very Renaissance. He's broken the mold. This one now comes bursting out of the top, and we have this wonderful loggia, and we have the shadow, we have the sky, both there and there. And so these figures now are coming together in a very realistic way, despite the fact that it's the archangel appearing to a woman. She's very much a woman, thumbing her book, keeping her place in her book, even despite the surprise of the angel appearing before her. I'll look at two more paintings and then let Bill go into some of these in much more detail. This one was a lot about, you can genuflect or collapse in front of it like Kenneth Clark did. It's a wonderful painting in the Uffizi. But finally, Piero did become a sort of court painter. He got a courtly patron who didn't tell him to paint a gold bag, who didn't give him a frame that was Gothic in structure, and who really let him do what he wanted. And Piero created this, one of the most famous portraits, some of the most famous portraits of the 15th century, in fact, of all time, of Battista Sforza and Federico da Montefeltro, where we see that this wonderful disparity between close-up and far away. And yeah, but he's thought about it. Piero was such an intellectual painter that he has, I mean, the jewelry that Battista is wearing is sort of a mirror of the jewelry of the countryside, the fortress, the wall of the town coming down, and the gouge cut into the lake here, which is an invention. There isn't a lake at this point. Piero was just showing the wonderful imagined landscape under the Montefeltros. That almost mirrors the gouged nose of Federico de Montefeltro that he received in 1451 when he was injured during a joust. Anyway, Piero got to paint for him, one of the great patrons of the age, really the equivalent of Lorenzo de Medici with his wonderful palace in Urbino. And so Piero then painted for him what I think is one of the great altarpieces, one of the great paintings of the 15th century, the Brera altarpiece, which is interesting for numerous reasons, not least that wonderful portrait of Federico kneeling when he's respectfully taken off his helmet and gauntlet. He was a great warrior, probably the most famous soldier of the age, and he shows his obeisance here by taking off his gauntlet and his helmet, kneeling, and you can see the way in which everyone has climbed down off their pedestals and out of their niches. They're now standing in the same ground, casting shadows on each other, all lit by exactly the same light, and standing in, crucially, not just a single unified space. It's a single unified space, but what a space it is, with this conch shell, with the ostrich egg, which is a symbol of the virgin birth above, and this architectural scheme that is going to recur. Bear in mind that he painted this in Urbino about a decade before Raphael was born, and we're going to see this kind of a scheme a couple of decades later in Raphael's School of Athens in the Vatican that he painted for Pope Julius II. Nothing, I mean, it's often said that nothing had been built that looked like the building that Raphael puts in the School of Athens. I'm sorry for not having an image of it here, but I'm sure most of you know it. Nothing had been built like that in 1510, 1511 when Raphael painted the School of Athens, but crucially in the 1470s, nothing had been built that looked anything like what Piero has painted here. It's an imagined space, and yet it's a vividly, specifically, rigorously imagined space in which we can see how the light falls on this conch shell. So it's really an exquisite painting, and is, I think, a testament not just what Piero could do when he had a princely patron, but a symbol of what Piero could do, period. Anyway, I'll hand over to Bill.
I think that if you ask what image do we have of Piero, it's interesting to think about it because, you know, if you say Leonardo, some painting comes to mind, or Michelangelo, but what comes to mind for me when I see the name Piero della Francesca is the cover of a book by the Milanese journalist Beppe Severgnini called Ciao America. And I always think of the wonderful image of Federico de Montefeltro with a baseball cap on backwards going to a Walmart. But I want to start with where Ross started, and that is to say that we know so little about Piero della Francesca. And let me suggest some ways that I think we can figure out some things that might be useful in understanding it. About 30 years ago, a book was published by a historian named Carlo Ginzburg called The Enigma of Piero. Leaving aside what he talks about in the book, certainly that's a phrase that's right. As Ross suggested, a man who knows his anecdotes like nobody else has essentially no anecdote. When possible disease is the best you can do, okay? We don't have a lot of stories. I mean, we have stories of murder, death, violence, corruption, and acts of great virtue for so many of the other painters, but nothing for Piero. In fact, we don't know when he was born, as Ross pointed out. He lived to be 80 years old. In fact, he died on a rather auspicious day, the day that Christopher Columbus landed in the New World, October 12, 1492. One of the things that I want to talk about with regard to the enigma of Piero is, where did this guy learn to paint? And this has always been a problem for scholars. And for many years, they had it figured out. Just exactly what you'd expect them to want to figure out. Of course, he was trained in Florence. And here's the way the argument goes. He was born in the 1420s, and at the age of 19 or so, he came to Florence with a painter named Domenico Veneziano, He was here, we don't quite know how long. We know he painted with Domenico Veneziano, presumably as his apprentice, and therefore, even though Domenico Veneziano is sort of a quasi-Florentine, he actually came from Venice, as his name suggests, nevertheless, see, Piero was Florentine. And then, wouldn't you know it, people figured out he was born a lot earlier, and therefore he came to Florence in 1439 at the age of 27, and he was an apprentice, and he was probably pretty good when he got there. So we sort of have to go back and say, where did this guy learn to paint? And there are lots of different answers that people have given. Certainly, there were local painters, as Ross pointed out. This painter from Anghiari, named Antonio, well, you can wave to him from San Sepolcro. It's just a little town right across the valley, and we know that he and Piero did do some work together. We also know he's not a particularly distinguished painter. Another possibility is a painter from Gubbio named Ottaviano Nelli, because we know that Nelli had a contract that he never fulfilled in Borgo San Sepolcro. He no doubt had been to Borgo San Sepolcro, and therefore perhaps Piero learned something from him. Turns out, although Ottaviano Nelli is not a name probably that you go to bed thinking about, a pretty good painter. And in fact, one of the things we like to do with Friends of Florence programs is introduce even people who really know and love their art to some new things. So we're going to be looking to his masterpiece, which is in the Church of San Agostino in the town of Gubbio. But I want to argue that we need to start with the San Sepolcro of Piero. What were the big paintings around when he was growing up? What do we have there that he would have looked at from the time he was a little boy? And the answer is virtually all the paintings done either when he was young or before he was born that we still have in San Sepolcro were done by painters from Siena. It seems that Florentine painters didn't work there, but Sienese painters did. In fact, Ross showed you a painting of the Resurrection that was done more than a century before Piero did his famous Resurrection in San Sepolcro, and those two paintings are today, as they were then, right across the street from each other. So there were, in fact, Sienese paintings that were there when he was growing up. And in his younger years, what was the most important commission painted in San Sepolcro? This is a no-brainer. By far, a painting that began in 1438, a two-sided altarpiece, and it was painted by a Sienese. Part of it today is in London, one little piece of it by Sassetta is in France, and about half of it is up the hills away at Itati. And so these are the artistic events, and these are the artistic documents that were there when Piero was growing up. And if you ask what were the styles of Piero's paintings, and not just his earliest one, as we've already seen, they tend to be Gothic frames. Now, we can argue, and probably with some correctness, that these frames were not things that Piero might have chosen for himself. After all, especially when you're a young artist getting your start, you paint what they tell you. Not just in that contract, but also, you don't get to say, can I design the shape? You'd love this new thing on your altar. It's not like anything you've seen before. By and large, that's not the way patrons think. And by and large, some upstart local kid who is painting is not going to dictate what an altarpiece of a major organization, a confraternity, is going to do. And therefore, a lot of the times, it's assumed, you know, Piero wouldn't have painted that kind of stuff. He didn't have to. Right? This is stuff sort of forced upon him. He's got to use this Gothic style and have gold backgrounds. And I want to argue that we don't know that. He might have liked gold backgrounds. He might have liked Gothic altarpieces. That doesn't mean that he couldn't do remarkably innovative things, as Ross showed you with the painting of the baptism. But I think we should not necessarily assume that he sort of held his nose and painted these things because he needed to make a buck. I think we ought, because I want to argue that one of the things we can see in Piero, maybe more than any other painter of the Renaissance, is he learned things in a lot of different places. I think he might have liked them all. I think he's one of those people who can look at a painting and say, well, I don't want to paint anything that looks like that, but he does this well. I'd like to borrow that. I think I can take something I see in this work and work it into my own style. And so, yes, there's some Florentine stuff. Again, when when Piero came here in 1439, he looked at a lot of things. He almost certainly, I think, went to Pisa, because we're going to see one painting in a few minutes that seems to be very much inspired by a work of Masaccio that at that time was in Pisa, although that work is now in a museum in Naples. And again, Domenico Veneziano might have been born in Venice, but he was largely a Florentine painter, although he brought very Venetian colors. I mean, when you think of Domenico Veneziano, his one great painting that you see when you go through the Uffizi is this altarpiece that actually came about a block from here originally, from the Church of Santa Lucia. And when people stop and look at it, the thing that strikes them more than anything else are the colors. They're not like other Florentines' colors. They're pastels, they're pinks, and soft greens, colors that perhaps came from his Venetian tradition. And yet, if you look at the architectural space in that painting, it is clearly influenced by the Florentine developments with the writings of Brunelleschi and with the work of Masaccio and others. He learns a lot in Florence. Let me give you an example. In 1439, one of the new paintings in Florence was the tomb in the Cathedral of Florence of Sir John Hawkwood by Paolo Uccello. Go look at it. Because if you stand below it and you look, you see that it is aimed at two different directions. The bottom of it, it looks like you're looking up at this stone monument. Of course, it's really painted. But when you look at the monument itself, you're seeing it not from below, you're seeing it right as if you were standing way up high and looking at it. It's got kind of a bi-perspective. And guess what? Piero does exactly that in the Resurrection in Borgo San Sepolcro. That he's learning things. He doesn't paint anything that looks much like Uccello, but he's learning things from his experiences here in Florence and from everywhere else he goes. There was a very developed school of painting in Rimini, where he was for a while. A very powerful narrative style that developed in the 14th century, and I think we can see elements of that. He went to Rome, where he saw, among other things, new Florentine paintings by a fellow named Fra Angelico. But he also saw, of course, many other things, including a lot of ancient ruins. And all of this somehow gets worked into a style that's not any of those. He's not a Florentine, he's not a Sienese, he's not a Riminese, he's not any of those things, he's Piero. And yet he's taken everything he had. I might add later on, intellectually, he does that as a mathematician. He wrote 3 books, by the way. Not many artists write books. He wrote 3 books, all about mathematics. And, by the way, not a single anecdote. You'd think he'd say, before I write this damn mathematical book, let me tell you what I did last week. As a practical joke, you'd die for that. But he just doesn't ever give in to that for us. So, I want to suggest that more than perhaps any other painter I can think of, he's a Renaissance Italian painter that we cannot identify with a style. He learns locally, and that means in Borgo San Sepolcro. He learned perhaps from a painter from Gubbio, from Florence, from Siena, from Rimini. By the way, for a while he was a lodger in Urbino, and he lodged with the father of Raphael, who was himself a painter, not a terribly distinguished one. But you can imagine lodging with a painter in a place you've never been before. I bet he took Piero around to see some of the sights. And therefore, I see in Piero this wonderful synthesis. I mean, obviously every artist borrows from different individuals in different schools, but Piero does it seems almost seamlessly to me. You don't say, well, there's Florence. That looks just like a Sienese thing. And even though he does quote earlier paintings, I want to suggest there's something really special about what he does. Now, I'm going to ask Ralph to work on the technology here, because this is not, to say the least, as my children, my forte. This is a Sienese painting, as you can see here. It's by Niccolo di Segna. And it is in what's now the cathedral. It was then a monastic building right in the center of San Sepolcro. San Sepolcro was not even big enough to have a bishop in Piero's day. But I want you to look. Nobody would ever walk in and say, damn, that looks a lot like something that came from Piero della Francesca's hometown, right? It is a Sienese painting of the first half of the 14th century. Something that looks perhaps more like Duccio or Pietro Lorenzetti than it does anything that we can associate with the wonderful Piero della Francesca. But I want you to notice the way the resurrection is depicted. They could say, why are there so damn many resurrections around Borgo San Sepolcro? Because the name of the town is San Sepolcro, which after all means the Holy Sepulchre. I'll get to the story of why it's called that in a minute. So this is going to be a central image in San Sepolcro more than almost any place else I know of in Italy. And so what we have is the Jesus coming out of the tomb. See the Roman soldiers sort of sacked out there, and Jesus' left leg, as you can see, is on the edge of the tomb. That was not the way the resurrection had been depicted even 20 years earlier. 20 years earlier, the resurrection in a cycle of the life of Jesus was always the empty tomb with an angel sitting on the side and the three Marys coming and the angel saying he's not here, he's been raised exactly as he promised. The change took place about 20 years before this painting was done by a Sienese named Piero della Francesca in the lower church of San Francesco in Assisi. It's in the left transept of the lower church. I'm sure many of you have seen that cycle that Piero della Francesca did. And so this is very Sienese because it's a Sienese that invented this way of showing the resurrection. Now obviously Piero's is going to be radically different in a lot of ways, but I want you to notice first of all the pose of Jesus. And I want you to notice he has on a kind of peculiarly colored cloak that we might expect red and blue. Those are good royal colors and all that sort of stuff. But it's kind of a pinkish color. Let's look at what Piero does in the same scene across the street, literally, in the city hall. Coming to a theater near you. There. Look at that. It's a very different painting. It's a radically different painting. But if you walk into the city hall of Borgo San Sepolcro, however this strikes you, you're going to say, I've seen that before somewhere. Doesn't look exactly like it. And it turns out it's across the street. It's in the church you probably worshipped in that Sunday and every Sunday. Certainly the church you went to for the great feasts of the city. And so Piero has given us some link. Now was he told to do that? Did he have to make it that color? Did he have to show the resurrection in the same pose? We don't know. There's no contract. But I just have a sense about Piero because of this way I see him borrowing things, that this might be something he actually did willingly. Something that he thought was beautiful and wonderful and important for his fellow citizens. After all, this is not working in somebody else's hometown. This is working in your hometown. A town, by the way, of about 5,000 people at this time. So I think these are the kinds of ways we get to watch Piero. You know, so often, I heard a speech once given by a great Renaissance historian named Paul Oscar Christeller. And it was a very funny speech about the Renaissance. And he was talking about the fact that so often we assume the Renaissance is about all new ideas as opposed to the Renaissance, that is to say, reviving and rethinking old ideas. And Christeller, who was sort of a grumpy guy as far as I can tell, sort of paced the floor and said, the problem with most new ideas is they're bad. That most of the good ideas have already been come up with. Well, we can argue with that, of course. But I think Piero is one of those guys that say, I want to create something new, different. And I see all kinds of different people creating now, whether it's somebody in Florence or wherever. I see creation from the past, whether it's an ancient piece of sculpture in Rome, or whether it's a Sienese altarpiece across the street from the city hall. And I want to do something that's new, and I want to take everything that's been done well before and find a way to use it and blend it together and synthesize it into something that is new and spectacular and beautiful. Now, because I'm a medievalist at heart, all this Renaissance stuff is sort of at the edge of my knowledge, I want to turn to one painting, the Misericordia altarpiece, and talk about something we too rarely do. Now, there it is. We're just going to look at this for a little bit. And this is the kind of painting which most people, including people who are Florentine fans, they see these in a museum and they ask what's in the next room. How many people do you see upstairs in the Accademia where these are a dime a dozen? Right? That is a big Gothic altarpieces. Now, we don't have the original frame for this. These are all the pieces. We have all the pieces, but not the original frame. We know this is the way it's arranged. But the tendency is to say, well, the middle part's a little bit odd, and that is to say it's not a Madonna and Child, but it's a different painting of the Mother of Mercy. But nevertheless, this is one to walk by. Let's go find something really interesting. I want to suggest, this is my favorite Piero painting. I'm not trying to twist your arm. What I want to do is try to convince you that this is a painting that has great meaning, and that Piero found ways to do something old, something new, something borrowed, and if you count at least a few pieces, something blue. It's all here. So this is done for the confraternity of the Misericordia. And in fact, you know that because this is their symbol. Okay? They're not going to let anybody take their painting. Everybody's going to know where this painting belongs. Piero's family were members of this confraternity, and in all likelihood, so was he. And it was a confraternity that took care of pilgrims and took food to the sick and did the works of charity, what Christians call the corporal works of mercy. And the central image is the Madonna of Mercy, Mater Misericordiae in Latin. It's a very beautiful image. It was all the way back, not in art, but at least in words, to the 12th century. It's actually a wonderful story that creates this image. It's in the writings of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century Cistercian monk. And it goes this way. That a monk dies, Cistercian monk dies, and he goes to heaven, and he's so distressed he doesn't see any other Cistercian monks. And this really bothers him because he assumed all the monks who preceded him he would find in heaven. So the Virgin Mary, I'm sort of paraphrasing, says, "Come over here, kid." And she opens her cloak, and there they all are, under her special protection. And from that beginning image, we begin to get, in the 14th century, we find them here in Florence and other places, this idea of the Mother of Mercy. And that the Mother of Mercy will protect all of those who come to her and ask for help. A very powerful image given Pope Francis's declaration of this being the year of mercy. This is the image you ought to think of, it seems to me, when you're asking what is it exactly that Pope Francis is calling for. And so we have 8 people down here, 4 men, 4 women. There were no women in the confraternity. But we assume they were allowed to worship in the confraternity's church, and probably these are the wives of members. And so we have 4 of them, 4 of the men over here. You see, one has on this hood, because one of the things that the members of the confraternity did was to go in public in religious processions and whip themselves. Okay, that's a flagellant society, among other things. But you never do it where people can see who you are, because then you can become proud, or people can start praising you for your heroism. And so you wore this hood. It always spooks out Americans because it looks sort of Ku Klux Klanish. It has nothing to do with any of that stuff. And so these are members, and it's interesting, the women, there are 2 young women, there is a married woman, and there is a widow. So at least here, he hasn't probably just sort of picked out a lot of portraits. We don't know whether these are portraits or not. But if he has, he's at least chosen people in different parts of the life cycle. So it's a very interesting image. Now, of course, these altar pieces have saints. And as Ross pointed out, there's a continuous line here. And if we look, we ought to see who we've got. Over here on the left, we have Saint Sebastian. He's very well known. And this is very important because San Sepolcro was very badly attacked by the bubonic plague. And ever since the bubonic plague came in 1348, that Saint Sebastian was one of 2 saints that was most often called upon for help from the plague. It's kind of one of those historical mistakes that becomes a fact. That is to say, sometimes in the early time, Saint Sebastian was depicted without the arrows, and therefore he had these marks all over his body, and therefore it sort of looked like, well, they could be plague marks. And so Sebastian's the guy you call on. Go to San Gimignano. Okay, it's filled full of Sebastians. Because the plague took a higher percentage of the population of San Gimignano, as far as we know, than any other city in Europe. Okay, not Tuscany, not Italy, but Europe. So the plague is still a real thing. The plague continues to be in Europe until 1666. And the plague is still virulent. And so you're going to put in somebody who is going to call on the help of God to prevent the plague. No doubt there were many plague victims who had been served by the confraternity of mercy. Then we have John the Baptist. Now, San Sepolcro has a very interesting political history because it belonged to different people or different other political rulers during Piero's lifetime. But definitively, about the time this painting was done, San Sepolcro came under the power of Florence. Essentially, the Pope sold it to Florence. Maybe to anger Milan, but that's another story. Who is the patron saint of Florence, we all ask? Of course, it is John the Baptist. And so, there are a lot of reasons for putting John the Baptist in the painting. He's in a lot of paintings in places where he was not the patron saint. But nevertheless, this may be one of the reasons, because he's not the patron saint of the town, but he's the patron saint, if you will, of the nation, or the city-state, of which now San Sepolcro was a part. Now, never disagree with Ross King. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I am going to disagree with Ross King. I want to argue that this is St. John the Evangelist, who I can't tell. And the main reason I would argue for that is he was the patron saint of the town of Borgo San Sepolcro. And so I think it's most likely that you've got these two Johns paired here, the patron saint of the local place and the patron saint of the larger political entity of which you are a part. Now, these are all very traditional saints. And then you get this guy. This was Bernardino of Siena. He died in 1444 and was canonized in 1450. And we know he's a saint here because you can see his halo. There were a couple images of him made in Siena before he was canonized. So this clearly dates from after 1450, although, as you can see, the painting was probably started before that time. And so we have Bernardino of Siena, sort of the new saint on the block. A man who may have preached in Borgo San Sepolcro, he seemed to have preached everywhere else, including a lot in Florence, and even more, of course, in his hometown of Siena. He's also a Franciscan friar, you can tell that by his clothes, and there are 3 Franciscan friars in this painting, and I would therefore want to argue that although the confraternity was not under the specific sponsorship of the Franciscans, clearly they were influential to this organization. And why wouldn't they be? If you're in the mercy business, what saint might you most associate with what it is that this confraternity does? Now, if you look up above, these 2 saints on the left, you see 2 other figures. On the left is St. Benedict. Now, as I said, this was not a cathedral city, but it was a city with a monastery, and the monastery had monks, including one of Piero's brothers, who lived under the rule of St. Benedict. So it makes sense that Benedict in this painting, because in a sense the monks of an order that uses the rule of St. Benedict were the ones who had the most important religious foundation in the city. And opposite is no less a guy than St. Francis himself. You can see him up there, and in fact you can see his stigmata. And so once again that reinforces the Franciscanness, and notice that St. Francis, the founder of the order, is directly above San Bernardino, one of his sons, if you will, although a couple hundred years later. And then we have these little guys. We notice there's a certain hierarchy here. They aren't quite as important to the painting, and people very often ignore them, but they're all important. Let's take the left one at the top. That's St. Jerome. He's beating himself with a rock. Doesn't sound like somebody you want to necessarily lionize their painting, but St. Jerome was a penitent, but he was also a great scholar, and, at least in the ideas of people in the Middle Ages, he founded a religious order of hermits. And so I'm going to argue that these little guys are especially heavy into founders of religious orders. Okay, so we have Jerome over there. Over here at the top, on the other side, is St. Augustine, with his bishop's hat and a book and a black robe, because there were Augustinian friars in Borgo San Sepolcro. He's probably there more as a founder of an order than anything else. In the middle row, we have St. Anthony of Padua, the second Franciscan saint, holding a fire, so that's how we know who it is. And then over here we have St. Dominic holding a lily, and of course the Dominicans were an order of the same time as the Franciscans. So this is very religious-oriented in terms of the orders that are indicated here, perhaps suggesting that in this confraternity they in fact had a kind of special guidance from Franciscans, because again there are 3 Franciscans here, but also all the orders were orders that they wanted to honor, and all the orders perhaps provided services for them. After all, you can't in a confraternity have a mass without a priest. And of course this is a lay order, and therefore would need a priest. The 2 guys down below are different because it's hard to recognize their iconography. The first time I studied this painting, I kept saying, I get the other guys, I don't know who these are. Well, this is Arcano, and this is Egidio. Guess what they did? They founded Borgo San Sepolcro. Because Borgo San Sepolcro, now let's face it, in the Renaissance, what do you want to be able to say to the world? My city was founded by the ancient Greeks or Romans, right? We don't call that classical stuff. Well, San Sepolcro wasn't. Now, neither was Siena, but Siena made up stories. But at any rate, San Sepolcro doesn't make up an ancient story. They're very proud of these guys who, about the year 1000 or so, were coming back from the Holy Land as pilgrims. They stopped where San Sepolcro now is to sleep, And basically an angel said, stay there and build a chapel. And by the way, include the relic in it that you brought back from Jerusalem. A piece of stone that comes from the Holy Sepulchre. And so they did, and so that is where Borgo San Sepolcro is. So these are the local founders. And so we have the plague, we have a couple saints that might be there for political reasons, we have the new saint in town, we have the great religious founders, and now we also have some narrative parts of this painting. We haven't gotten to the good part yet. First of all, we know that how does the year begin? At the time Piero was living, it begins on the 25th of March. That's New Year's Day. It was in Florence, it was in San Sepolcro, it was the day the Archangel Gabriel came to announce to the Virgin Mary that she would bear the Christ child. And so this is the Annunciation, which is not only the beginning of our salvation, but it's also the beginning of the new year. It's a time to start over for all of humankind on a universal scale, and just like we make our New Year's resolutions, it's time to start over again at the beginning of the year. So we have here the Annunciation. And then we have several other stories, although the predella was painted by a different artist. Probably Piero had some say in what was there and what was involved in this design. But of course at the top we have the Crucifixion. This is the painting that clearly indicates to me that he studied Masaccio. Of course there's a wonderful image of the Trinity in Santa Maria Novella, but I also want to suggest again, this is very close to a work that Masaccio did that's now in Naples and was in Pisa when Piero was alive. So we have the Annunciation, we have the Crucifixion. But down here, we also have a narration. Here we have Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. There are Peter, James, and John, and there is Jesus praying. We have the flagellation. We don't always have that in cycles of the end of the life of Christ, but we need to have it here because this was a flagellant society, among other things. Why do you beat yourself? Because Jesus got beaten. And that therefore we want to take on that same pain that Jesus endured. The Crucifixion, of course, is up there. And then we come down to Jesus being put in the tomb. So there's Jesus, there's the tomb. You've got to have the sepulchro if you're in San Sepolcro. Okay? You've got to have it. And so the center is the entombment. And this is a very interesting painting, and it's been driving me crazy now for the last 3 weeks because you've got all the standard people there. You've got the Virgin Mary, John the Evangelist, and Mary Magdalene. You've got Nicodemus and another one of the important people from the Jewish Sanhedrin. And then you got this woman, and she's dressed as a nun. Now, as a historian, I got to tell you, the odds of there being a nun at the time that Jesus is being buried is 0. But she's a nun wearing a black habit. And who else wears a black habit? Look at Augustine. This is almost certainly St. Monica, Augustine's mother. Exactly why she's there, we don't know. One possibility, and this is the kind of thing that we know happens in the Renaissance. Somebody said, my mother was named Monica. If you put Monica in there, I'll contribute to this. You never know. It could have been something just that mundane that got St. Monica put in this painting. Then we have Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene after he's risen from the dead. And guess what's over here? Not usually in paintings, but this is Borgo San Sepolcro. There's a sepulchre. And here we have the angel at the tomb, the traditional resurrection image with the 3 women. So we have the Holy Sepulchre 3 times in this story. Normally you wouldn't see it that way. So what I want to argue is this is a very carefully thought out and constructed program. It's made for people in San Sepolcro. It makes a lot more sense for them than it would for Florentine, let alone for us. But this is the way so much art in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance works. And so when we take time to look at the details, most of which we would know if we knew enough iconography. Again, I had to cheat and find out who these guys were. But most of these things we can recognize fairly easily or learn about fairly easily. And when we do that, we discover this is not just a wonderful and beautiful painting, but it's a painting by and for a person from Borgo San Sepolcro. It is by and for a community of people. It's assembled their stories, their saints, the new guy, the new political guy, the old political guy, the current disease guy, the guy who passed through 20 years ago probably preached in town, along with the story of the salvation of all humankind. And so when we do that, next time you go to the Academia, walk by David, don't take any time with that, you've been there before. Walk upstairs, look at the altarpieces, and all of a sudden, they don't all look alike. And if you want to think of one of the most beautiful and magnificent of them all, you got to get out of the Academia, hop on the road, and head to Borgo San Sepolcro. Very few people wear the subject of their lecture. If you want to know where to get a tie that has the Misericordia, I'll give you the information later on.
Thank you both so much, and they've agreed to take a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, Alessio will be happy to come hear you with the mic. Yes.
Hi. I can't help myself not thanking you first, because as I was saying, I had more than my dinner just by listening to you. Just a question regarding the guy from the Misericordia with the hood on. Just I'm looking for confirmation for another bit of information I had about him regarding the play. The role that they were playing in assisting the community during the plague was getting out the dead and providing people who were ill with provisions. And one of the reasons for the hood, I heard, had to do with maintaining these people's anonymity within the community, so that people would not suffer the prejudice of them being having got having got the disease or etc.
I have heard that. I've never been very convinced by it, only because we get a lot of documents from the period of the Black Death that said what was regarded as the way of avoiding bubonic plague was to carry a certain kind of nosegay, and it was from having this sort of combination of flowers and herbs and so on, that the evil things that could creep into your body through your nose were kept out. But, you know, flagellation was very rare before the Black Death. And you know, one of the things the Black Death does is stimulate all kinds of, we might say, extreme behaviors. You know, sort of like the 2016 presidential election. But at any rate, what we begin to get are these confraternities come to specialize. This is true in a big city like Florence. So you would have societies that were purely flagellant societies. You would have other societies that would do nothing particular other than sing songs of praise. They were called the Laudesi. They sang lauds. The painting by Duccio in the Uffizi, the big Madonna and Child, was done for a Laudesi society, for example, in 1285 for San Marino Vello. And then you got the flagellants, and in some of the confraternities, but especially in small towns, they did all those things. So these were sort of the generalists, if you will, and not the specialists. But I think it has much more to do with humility than it does from starting with a way of avoiding the plague.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about La Madonna del Parco, to speak of, you know, innovation and something that we haven't seen.
Exactly. I think, sadly, I don't think I've got an image of it on this particular file, but I'm sure many of you know the image, which is of again, it's a very large Madonna. I mean, one of the things that Piero did very beautifully was paint women, and paint very strong women. You know, whether it's Mary Magdalene in the cathedral in Arezzo, whether it's the Misericordia Madonna that we see here, or the Madonna del Parto, who is this very beautiful Madonna who is, again, going back to what Bill's saying, Piero is taking a tradition and in some ways putting a new spin on it. He's doing something different with it. And it's interesting that that particular genre of Madonna paintings originated in Tuscany within the century before Piero, century and a little bit before Piero. And it is one in which the I think there's something like 9 or 10 of them that still exist. And everyone but Piero's, the Madonna is wearing very high up on her waist, above her bum. She's wearing a belt, and it's believed by art historians, I think quite convincingly, that this is a representation of the girdle in Prato, and it's a kind of referencing of that, which would explain both the reason why this became very popular in Tuscany, in this particular area, and also why she has the belt. And you might know that the Italian word for pregnant, incinta, comes from the Latin incinta, which means unbelted, because of the fact that as pregnant she cannot be belted. And so the belt is very high up. Piero doesn't have it. I think it would be, in some ways I'm almost disappointed that he doesn't have it, because it would put him in that tradition. He is in that tradition, but we can't then say that he knew of these other paintings in Florence and elsewhere, and that there's that kind of a direct link which might put him in a particular place, in a particular time, with a particular anecdote, so we could know something about his life, know a little bit more about him, and know what paintings exactly he looked at. But it's a wonderful painting, and it's really speaks to the Piero as a Tuscan painter partaking of this particular tradition.
And also on Turkey, where this painting is located, is where Piero's mother is from. And we think that this might have been done shortly after she died. There are even people who think he came back home after his mother died, or as his mother was dying. And therefore, to paint a pregnant woman in the place where his mother came from, it might be a very personal painting, as well as something that's taking up broader themes and borrowing from a tradition like Ross suggested.
Thank you very much. The reason for my asking is that Pier Paolo Pasolini, the Italian director who made a lot of movies, whose iconography is very much based on Quattrocento Tuscan painting, chooses La Madonna del Parto for his Virgin Mary in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And it's a very, very powerful quotation that he makes of Piero. So it influenced also the world of the cinema, not only the more contemporary art. Thank you again for our